today, and thank you for the invitation. I've had a great couple of days talking to or reading for students around Birmingham and around the Birmingham area. So it's been a wonderful experience. I want to read a little bit of Like Trees Walking and just, leave some time at the end and we can kind of have a little discussion, answer a few questions here and there about just the book itself, but also the writing process. I'm going to start with the prologue, a few pages from the prologue, and a couple of other selections. July 14, 2003. Those of us already gathered along the beach checked the wind. With matches cupped in our hands, we watch the smoke rise in the breeze that comes off the water. The conditions have to be right. The wind has to be blowing east, rising tide in an overcast sky. Nights like these, when conditions are right along the eastern shore of Mobile Bay, the salt water from the Gulf mixes with the fresh water from the rivers. The fish and blue crabs stop swimming then. Why it happens, I'm not exactly certain. Something about the oxygen, the water temperature, and the currents no longer running true. The fish and the blue crab are stunned and traumatized, and at the place where the waters meet, they just float on the surface like they're dead. When the tide rises in the early morning hours, the silver sides of the flounders shine as they wash up on the shore. The crabs collect in the soft sand just below the surface of the water. We wait for them here. Some gather them with scoop nets and stakes, while others pick them up in their bare hands and carry them home in wash tubs and baskets. Nights like these are called Jubilee. A constellation of matches, lighters, and flashlights pepper in the dark, flickering like a far-off city. For as long as there have been people here, these nights on the eastern shore have been mystic hours. Before the slaves and settlers, the Mobile Indians gathered what the waters left at their feet. The explorers who came here named this place the Bay of the Holy Spirit, trying to appease the shallow waters that endangered their vessels. The bay bottom is covered with the remains of ships that got battered to pieces. The slaves called the waters sacred as well, but for different reasons. They believed these waters were spirited by slaves who died on the boats, their bodies thrown into the night waters. When the Jubilee nights came, the slaves called what the waters left their manna. They were said to have believed that the waves were God's hands pushing it to the shore. Jubilee was a word that meant everything to them, freedom or heaven, whichever came first. For some of the Africans who lived here, these nights were the only times when food was plentiful. All these years later, such nights have become recreation. For me, they are an escape from the world on the quiet end of the beach. A night of solitude before a birthday with too many candles. March 23rd, 1981. The medical examiner's plan had been very specific. My father explained to me what they had worked out over the phone. Bertrand, one of my father's drivers, would drive a hearse to the main entrance of the morgue and wait. A few minutes later, I was supposed to drive the cargo van to a side entrance, where Dr. Warner would turn over Michael's remains. We would meet at 4:45. Dr. Warner didn't want us to wait too long outside because the photographers and the news cameras were waiting, and the coroner hoped to avoid another spectacle. When I drove past the front entrance, 4 photographers were already there waiting. A Channel 9 station wagon idled near the covered entryway on the side of the main building. A newswoman mouthed her practice words as she stood beside an empty tripod. They all were looking at Bertrand, leaning against the 1981 Cadillac Crown Sovereign, the newest in our fleet, polishing out smudges with a chamois. He played his part perfectly, even looking at his watch and then to the door. The photographers must have had the picture framed in their heads, a body bag rolled out of the morgue and loaded into the shiny black hearse. They never looked my way as I drove around back. It was just then 4:45. If Dr. Warner had kept to the schedule at that moment, he was rolling Michael's body down the long corridor, through the unfinished new wing, away from the waiting cameras. His plan to preserve some semblance of privacy for the family, even if it seemed too late. Just beyond the dumpsters, I got out of the van to move aside the orange cones that blocked the parking lot entrance. The blacktop still had its brand new luster, and the lines hadn't been painted yet. The new wing of the hospital was scheduled to open early that summer, and from the street the top of the building was hidden behind the scaffolding and surrounded by stacks of brick that would complete the last corner of the facade. The yellow pollen that covered the shipping dock had mixed with the reddish dust of bricks. After only a few steps, it was all over my shoes. I polished them religiously, but ultimately it seemed pointless. Walking through the cemetery grass, stepping through the red clay around fresh-made graves, the shine was fleeting. A danger sign had gotten wet and wrinkled by the spring rains, and the paper had broken away from the tape that held it to the double doors. Through the windows just above the sign, Dr. Warner came into view 100 feet down the corridor. He walked at the front right of the gurney, and an assistant pushed from behind. We're supposed to open the bag and make sure we have the right body, but that time I didn't have to. The look on Dr. Warner's face was proof enough. Besides, I only wanted to open the bag once. I rolled the gurney to the bumper and locked the wheels. The metal was still cold to the touch, and the spring humidity had made a thin fog along the steel. Dr. Warner gently gathered the bag around Michael's ankles and pushed from behind, and his assistant lifted from underneath. As I lifted from the front, I felt the weight of Michael's shoulders and head against the slick plastic that was as cold as the metal below it. I thought about Bertrand sitting out front. The hearse he'd driven was plush. Whenever the pallbearer slid the casket onto the chrome rollers, it rested against the soft interior. The cargo van was just an empty space with nothing to soften the bare walls. It was unembellished, just like the bodies it was meant to carry. "Roy, I need you to sign for him," Dr. Warner said. While I signed the triplicate forms, the coroner stared down at the bag as if he could see through the plastic. He handed me a copy of the death certificate, which smelled of the blue-black ink that had smeared in places. Another envelope held the autopsy report. The coroner always provides the morticians with the findings to help us with our work. The particulars of death, wounds, swelling, lacerations dictate the restoration. I glanced down at the paper. Michael's filled in blanks. Cause of death, asphyxiation. Mechanism of death, plastic rope. Time of death, approximately 12 a.m. Height, 6 feet. Weight, 150 pounds. Age, 19. He glanced toward the parking lot entrance through horn-rimmed glasses that dated him. No news vans, no cameras. His plan had worked, but all things considered, there wasn't much solace. I had known Dr. Warner for years. He fished the same waters my grandfather did, and when we transferred bodies, there was often small talk about rides and reels, artificial lures, and such. On that day, there wasn't much for Dr. Warner to say. Just a sad proclamation before he disappeared down the corridor. "I've never seen anything like it," he said. "A sin and a shame." When I drove around the corner, Bertrand was still standing beside the hearse with his arms crossed, chamois in one hand and the other cradling his chin. He had driven for my father since well before I was born. Just about every Saturday morning, he drove one of our family cars, and in the afternoon, he would go to Mass at St. Augustine's. He didn't make eye contact when I passed him. He just dipped his head and made a quiet cross, thumb against the salt and pepper of his beard. The photographers looked toward the automatic doors for the body I carried. I wondered how long they would stand there, waiting in vain. My grandfather had been stifled by the shaking in his hands and a memory that sometimes failed him. We worried that he wouldn't be able to live alone much longer, but as he worked around Michael's head, stitching the ruptured skin and reshaping his face, his hands were steady and his memory was sound. He remembered things we had never known: how to dress rope-burned skin, how to wire a neck broken and distended to make the bones straight again, arrange the high starched collar and the necktie so they hid the marks that makeup could not conceal. I watched him as he worked, cradling Michael's head in his hands. He held it like he held mine in the waters along the bay. On the summer afternoon, he tried to teach me to float. I floated for a while, but when I opened my eyes and realized his hands were gone, and what I felt along my neck and back was just a memory of his fingers, I sank like a rock. March 28, 1981. As I drove Michael's body to the Revelation Sanctuary, I thought about the last time I'd seen him alive. Fat Tuesday. Mardi Gras had come and gone 3 weeks before Michael's murder, and Mobile had been a different place then. From the Friday before until sundown on Fat Tuesday, the city shuts down so everyone can party. No work, no school. Carnival was my favorite time of year for one simple reason: funerals almost never happen during Mardi Gras. That's partly out of tradition and partly logistics. Funeral processions can't move through the streets that have been closed for parades that start every morning and keep rolling until well after dark. The only processions that pass through the barricaded streets are those meant for revelers. Dozens of parades roll down Government Street and circle Bienville Square before returning uptown. Each parade is sponsored by one of the carnival crews, the Order of Pharaohs, the Mystics of Time, the Crew of Columbus. Their members are mostly white. Unlike most other cities along the Gulf Coast, Mobile still has its black parades. The biggest is the Mammoth Parade that rolls every Fat Tuesday afternoon. I had never seen as many black folks at one place at one time as I had seen on the corner of Broad and Government at 3:30 on Mardi Gras Day. The Mammoth Parade took a different route than the others, snaking through the black neighborhoods that circle downtown, passing the frat houses and the social clubs, and going over by Bishop State. It stretched for miles with masked horsemen wearing the purple, green, and gold carnival colors, Mardi Gras Indians, black cowboys, and marching bands from all over. The Mammoth Parade always had a couple of dozen floats, each sponsored by a local club. Once we each turned 16, Paul and I joined a club called the Porters, started by some of the old men who had worked on the train. If we paid $35, watched cars, and came to the meetings once a month, we could ride the float come Mardi Gras. We had to buy our own throws, and the drinking policy was BYOB. Everyone on our steam engine float had 10 or 15 bags, hard candy, bubble gum, beads, doubloons, and as many boxes of moon pies. The golden rule of riding a float was that you never showed your face. Violators got fined or kicked off. Under the dark, narrow masks, it was hard to see once the sun went down. The branches of the thick trees that lined either side of Government Street made a canopy that brought dusk too early. As the parade made the final turn on the Broad, beneath the trees in my mask, it was hard to see who was who. I aimed at the voices that yelled my name, throwing blindly when the day was at its darkest, and those minutes after the sun had gone down and just before the streetlights kicked on. All of our friends were waiting toward the end of the route we had started 3 hours before. It felt like everybody I knew in the world was on those sidewalks. People would claim the same places year after year. Slim and Reuben were always in the supermarket parking lot. My folks waited in their folding chairs in front of the Elks Lodge. The Waters always cooked out on the ball field behind Dunbar. On Mardi Gras, I realized how many people I knew, as I saw their faces among the thousands waiting to catch the good throws we saved until the end. I always threw beads a few strands at a time, making sure I didn't run out. My brother had no such worries. He ripped open his last bags and threw them all at once. Handfuls of beads and moon pies and anything else. The gold and silver beads caught the glint of the streetlight as they flew high, some landing in the trees while the rest disappeared into the crowd of hands. Pony's voice was always the loudest, and when he started hollering, Paul aimed his throws toward his collected friends. Earl and Tunk caught what they could in upside-down umbrellas, and Michael stood next to them, arms out to catch what came his way. Paul threw as much as he could for as long as he could, until the float moved out of reach. Then we rounded the corner onto the avenue, and that was the last time I saw Michael Donald alive. The paper said that hundreds of thousands packed the streets during the Mardi Gras season, but early on that funeral morning, along those same city streets, there were few souls in sight. The only evidence of revelry were the odd strands of silver beads left among the branches, too high for the cleaning crews to reach. On that warm and vacant morning, as we made our way to Revelation, there was nobody there but us. Thank you.